a nation at war, racing against time to thwart a new Russian offensive that's already begun. Hello, I'm Adrian Finighan in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine.
And I'm Rob Matheson in Doha. This is our special week-long coverage on Al Jazeera of the Ukraine war, 1 year on. February 24th, 2022, the beginning of one of Europe's biggest and bloodiest armed conflicts since the start of the Second World War. Russia invades Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin sees two threats: Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO and what he believes are NATO's efforts to block Russia, threats that he wants to contain by force. The cost is high in lives and livelihoods. Russia is being swept by Western sanctions. 30 nations, making up the world's most powerful military alliance, have been drawn into the conflict. NATO members are providing unprecedented military aid to support Ukraine's fight, but Russia's allies are standing by Moscow. The war is taking a heavy toll. Cities, towns and villages across Ukraine have been bombarded. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides have been killed on the battlefield. Millions of people, mostly women and children, have been uprooted from their families and homes to shelter from the war. Ukraine and Russia are two of the biggest suppliers of grain and gas, and that means the impact of the conflict is being felt in millions of homes around the globe. Now, we know how the war began, but how is it going to end? And how will it reshape the world? Well, over the next several days, our correspondents from inside Ukraine, across Europe to Africa, Asia and North America are going to bring you stories covering all aspects of the conflict, 1 year on.
Well, we're here in the heart of the nation's capital. Across this country, millions of people are feeling the effects of the war as fighting destroys families and sirens interrupt lives. There's a sense of mourning and reflection in the air, but also of resilience and determination. Almost a year has passed since Russia launched a full-scale invasion on its neighbor. Both sides are trying to turn the tide of the war in their favor, but neither has been able to do so thus far. Let's head to downtown Kyiv, where my colleague Zein Basravi is standing by for us. Zein, it's good to see you. We didn't know that we'd be able to do this earlier this morning because once again, the air raid sirens sounded and people had to take shelter.
That's exactly right. Air raid alarms, air raid sirens go off once, twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day throughout the nights. And it is really something that has become a part of daily life for people all across this very vast country. Where we are now here in Kyiv, in the central part of downtown Kyiv, this is an area that dates back to the days of Joseph Stalin. It was developed as a commercial residential area under his direct instructions, and it has been an important location throughout this conflict since the day of invasion, and that's because in this area just right behind me, there are at least 3 separate entrances into underground subway metro stations that Ukrainians use for shelter. They were incredibly important during the first days of the invasion when the city took constant barrages of Russian missiles and artillery, fearing that Russians were going to roll into the capital any day. And even now, metro stations are where people go to take shelter when those air raid sirens go off. Ukrainians we've been speaking to say they are exhausted. They are emotionally and physically exhausted. But there is another reality. Fear from a year ago, fear at the early days of the invasion has turned into a kind of stoicism meant for their country. And even though they are exhausted, they say that they remain determined to carry on in this fight as long as it takes. You know, it was a very different reality a year ago. Ukrainians now say that every day that goes by, their position hardens, that they do want peace. They want it as soon as possible, but they don't want it through negotiation. They don't want it through dialogue. They want it off the back of victories on the battlefield. And whether the leaders are reflecting the opinion of the people or whether the people are echoing the notions of their leaders, people here say that they want every bit of territory back from Russia. They want it now, and they won't negotiate peace unless that happens. Here in the city of Kyiv, it is a very different city than it was a year ago. Businesses are reopening. The banks were not run on, and life is carrying on as normal. So there is a level of resolve. And as far as wartime capitals go, this is one that has the entirety of Europe, NATO, and the United States at its back. So it is still a city that is carrying on very normally. We met with the mayor of Kyiv, who is now attending the security conference in Munich as well, for his thoughts on this year of war that he's experienced. And here's what he had to say.
A year of war with Russia. Ukraine's capital is a city marked by invasion. People living in Kyiv adapting to conflict, but still able to fly their own flag. In the beginning, when Russian rockets began targeting this city, even Ukraine's closest allies expected Kyiv to fall in a matter of days.
Until the last moment, we don't believe it can happen in modern time to make a war in the middle of Europe.
Vitali Klitschko, Kyiv's mayor, says the events of the past year make one thing clear. Russia's President Vladimir Putin wants Ukrainian land, but not Ukrainian people.
Bucha, in my opinion, is a real face of this special operation. The Russians killed civilians, women, old people, teenagers. Nobody can explain the reason why they did that. And that's why after Bucha and Irpin, whole world see the real face of Russians invasion. It's not the war, because also the war have a rules. Never touched the children, never touched women. It's a genocide.
The outskirts of Kyiv still bear the scars of Russia's military operation. Snow-covered rubble is all that is left of Vasili's home in Bucha. A family of 7 reduced to a trailer in a driveway.
I feel this is a tragedy that happened to us. Russians claim they came to liberate us, and they did. They liberated us from everything. I have nothing.
Vasily is part Russian. Even rebuilding, he says, will not fix his broken heart. Still, he is lucky. Soldiers, he says, shot and killed 12 of his neighbors during the occupation. Nearly everyone on his street is gone.
Tanks that menaced civilian areas, places that were being directly targeted in the early days of the invasion, are now trophies from successful Ukrainian counteroffensives in the months that followed. But as the war enters a second year, Russian forces are once again amassing at Ukraine's borders. Cities here are experiencing airstrikes once again, and Russia seems to be gaining momentum on the Eastern Front.
Russia could attack Kyiv again at any time, but the city's mayor says they are better prepared.
We hope, every one of us, of Ukrainian, hope this war stopped in this year. But we are responsible for that, stop the Russians. And it's very important to stop this war and kick everyone, the Russian soldier, away from our territory.
And on the anniversary of the war, a message from Kyiv to Moscow.
I have a message for Vladimir Putin. We see our future as part of European family, and we don't want back to USSR. Point.
Zein, Basravi, Jazeera, Kyiv.
Well, joining me now, overlooking Maidan Square here in central Kyiv, is Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik, someone we've spoken to many times over the past year. Kira, welcome back to Al Jazeera. Yesterday we heard President Zelensky talking to leaders at the Munich Security Summit, talking of this David and Goliath fight, and also pleading once again to his allies to hurry up with the military equipment that he needs to continue fighting this war. How much frustration is there among your colleagues at the length of time that it's taking to get this equipment to Ukraine?
Well, Adrian, first of all, we are incredibly grateful for everything that we are receiving, for all kinds of weapons that helping us fight and giving us the chance for David to win over Goliath. However, what I learned over the past year is that time goes differently. It goes differently when you're sitting in a bomb shelter under the missile attacks, and when you are in a peaceful country making the decisions and thinking that you have another week or two for the bureaucratic processes. This is what our call is. We do not have time. Time is not money in our case. Time is a matter of life or death for Ukrainian people. Every single day, when Russia launches another strike on us, somebody dies. And every single day we're asking, is it going to be me? And this is why we are pleading for all the processes, all the logistics to become faster, more sophisticated, and for new and new weapons to be delivered to Ukraine. We are ready to fight. We are fighting so successfully, and we can win with our allies' help.
How concerned are you about this talk of a Russian spring offensive? What would your message be then to the leaders meeting in Munich at the moment, given all of that talk about this impending offensive, which some say has already begun?
Russia's strategy is to use their upper hand, their power, their scale. They're using people as a battlefield meat. They're using their weapons and a huge amount of supplies. We cannot afford that, and we will never do that. We need to use a different strategy. So we have to be smarter, we have to be faster, we have to be more sophisticated and more modern. And this is what we are doing. So whatever Russia will do, we have to be ready for any result of it. So in lieu of the spring offensive, which we believe already started in the East, we are saying, help us win. Please provide us all the necessary armory, all the necessary equipment, and especially supplies. This is what our army is lacking. For us, as politicians, our goal is to bring everything that our soldiers will need.
And we heard Zein talking a few moments ago about the resilience of the people in this city, in Kyiv. 1 year on, how do you explain that? How do you explain people's determination to carry on and to live life to the full?
This is our motherland, and we do not have any other choice. So we will be fighting for as long as it takes, protecting our ability to define our own future, but also an ability to define our physical existence, because it is a matter of life and death for us.
Kira, many thanks indeed. Really good to talk to you. Thanks for being with us once again. UN investigators say there's evidence that war crimes have been committed during the conflict. They visited Ukraine, focusing on areas where the most serious allegations were made against Russian or Russian-backed forces early in the war. They saw civilian areas that had been destroyed and places where people were detained or tortured. The team documented unlawful killings, including the summary execution of civilians and sexual violence. It says that Ukrainian forces were also responsible for rights violations, but significantly more crimes were committed by Russian troops. One of the cities they visited was Chernihiv, where a group of people queuing for bread were shelled in the first weeks of the fighting. Al Jazeera's Natasha Butler has been there to meet one woman who says that she narrowly escaped death that day.
The aftermath of a Russian attack in the northern Ukrainian city of Chernihiv last year. On the ground, bodies of civilians. They'd been queuing outside a shop for bread when they were hit by shells and rockets. 15 people were killed, dozens injured.
So you were standing around here?
Natasha narrowly escaped death that day by taking cover by this wall. She was in the queue with her son and mother-in-law. She plays me a recording she made on her phone.
We heard explosions near us. It was very close. And then we saw lots of people running everywhere.
At the time of the attack, Chernihiv was a city under siege. Russian forces were surrounding it and shelled it almost daily. They destroyed power and water supplies. Evidence of what happened is still visible nearly everywhere.
This is where people were lining up for bread that day. It is right in the middle of a residential area. And what prosecutors in the city say is that what happened on that day is a war crime, an indiscriminate attack on civilians.
Law enforcement agencies consider this a war crime because the main victims were civilians. Also, a pre-trial investigation found no evidence of Ukrainian military hardware that could be a legitimate target. Weapons were used indiscriminately.
All these marks, yellow marks, are the places of where rockets hit the buildings, make this information.
Marina Slobodyanuk works with a rights organisation called Truth Hounds that's helping prosecutors to build a case. It's collated evidence and used open source material, satellite imagery and social media to reconstruct what happened. Her team says it's traced the killings to a Russian unit that was positioned on the outskirts of the city.
We identified also the commander of this brigade, Oleg Kurygin, who might be liable and responsible for this very kind of attack.
Whether Oleg Kurygin or another officer was responsible for the attack on the bread queue might never be proved. Some investigators say he's back in Russia. It's clear that building legal cases and prosecuting alleged war crimes is a challenge. But for some Ukrainians, pursuing justice is at least one way of honouring the war's many victims. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Chernihiv, Ukraine.
Well, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, NATO has been expanding eastwards. Russia sees that as a threat to its national security. Moscow says it went to war to protect its interests, but is it succeeding? Mohammed Val explains.
Russia insists the decision to invade Ukraine was a defensive one and not taken just because Kyiv was becoming closer to Europe instead of neighboring Russia. Moscow was also against European military advisors training Ukrainian forces since 2014.
I made a decision to carry out a special military operation to protect people who for 8 years now have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kyiv regime. We'll seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine as well as bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against citizens of the Russian Federation.
Although Ukraine's leadership has denied Russian claims that Nazis were involved in fighting for the country, it's a fact the hardline Azov militia, founded by a right-wing extremist group, was integrated into forces of the Interior Ministry. Russia has held referendums in territories it's taken from Ukraine, including Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. While Western nations labeled them sham, Moscow has effectively annexed these regions, just as it did with Crimea.
There was a military reason to prevent Western missiles appearing in Ukraine for a direct strike on Moscow. There was a kind of geopolitical reason to reunite the Russian people, assuming that Ukrainians are Russian people, and actually undermine Western unity.
But President Vladimir Putin's quick special military operation has become a grueling conflict with an estimated tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Russian military analysts say the initial plan to fight the operation without a central command was later reversed. Wagner Group contractors, seen as mercenaries by Ukraine and its allies, have been prominent on the front lines. But the longer the war drags on, the greater the strain on Russia's economy. But for Moscow, Kyiv is a military threat, and the deployment of Western air defenses in Ukraine remains unacceptable. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera.
OK, let's bring in Sergei Markov live in Moscow. He was a member of the Russian parliament. He's now director at the Institute of Political Studies. Sir, very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. We've seen the focus for Russia's military, perhaps dictated by Moscow, as changing over the last 12 months. What do you think would be an acceptable political solution for Russia to this crisis that would allow it to end the conflict?
I think Vladimir Putin very clearly outlined 1 year ago Russian goal. We don't need a new territory. You may know from the school that Russia is the biggest country by territories. But Russia needs, first of all, to liberate people in Donbass from the terror attacking during 8 years, which conducted by Kyiv. Secondly, Russia needed to liberate Russian people, who is, by the way, 70% of the population of Ukraine, from the anti-Russophobic, repressive Kyiv regime, which deals nothing with democracy. Also, Vladimir Putin tell very clearly, we don't think that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but NATO already occupy Ukraine in making anti-Russia on Ukrainian territory and creating this threat to the Russia. It's not war 20th century. It's 20th century, 21st century war. It's proxy war. Ukraine has no government. Ukraine has no army. It's proxy army of the United States of America, exactly as, for example, Hezbollah is proxy army of Iran. So it's very modern 21st century force, and the lie, total lie from Kyiv, from Washington, from Brussels, from Paris, and from Berlin is the main characteristic of this war. Don't trust them, what they're telling. They are lying extraordinary.
With the fact that we are now seeing weaponry that is being supplied by Western forces, Western governments, that is now on the ground in Ukraine, has this been a miscalculation by the Russian government, which has actually brought Western weapons far closer to its borders and therefore at a far greater risk to Russia than it perhaps ever anticipated?
It's a very important question. It's absolutely clear that Russian leaders made a lot of mistakes when they started this special military operation. Russia, based on the fact that when Russia allowed Crimea to take part in Russia, 87% of the Ukrainian militaries decided to join Russian army, and Ukrainians, you know, that 90% of them support joining Russia. We believe that almost say will happen now, but we underestimate how effective United States occupy Ukraine and constructed artificial totalitarian state on the Ukrainian territory.
Sergei Markov, I'm very sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, but Sergei Markov in Moscow, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
30 nations of the world's largest military alliance, NATO, have been supporting Ukraine with heavy weapons, aid and training to defend itself against Russia. But it's been reluctant to provide a clear timeline in response to Kyiv's urgent calls for membership. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, is in Munich at the security conference. James.
Yeah, here, Adrian, everyone, I think, is talking about the issue of Ukraine. It's exactly 1 year ago that we saw President Zelensky here in Munich, his last trip before the start of the war. And I can tell you then, some observers said, we wonder whether we'll ever see him outside his country again. Of course, he was back here on video link and he's been travelling in Europe in the last week or so. Let's discuss where we are in the war right now with the former Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and a former peace negotiator. Let me start with that role. When is it time to stop fighting and start negotiating?
Well, I mean, stop fighting, you could say now, but that's not going to happen. We have no signs of the Russians being ready for the sort of the withdrawal that's going to be necessary in order to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I think they are both waiting, primarily the Russians are waiting for the possibility of some sort of military offensive to improve their position prior to some sort of talks. I think the Russian army so far is performing extremely unimpressively. So whether they will be able to really mount a true offensive remains to be seen.
When you look at what's going on in the Kremlin, and no one really knows what's going on in President Putin's mind, but you listen to the comments, it sounds like this is existential for him and his government. That's what he feels. So aren't we ultimately talking about regime change?
Well, I think we are to some extent, although that is a question that is up to the Russians. But I've been following Putin on the issue of Ukraine for quite a number of years. He has an obsession with the place. He has an impeccable track record for misjudging. He did that in 2004 in the Orange Revolution. He did that in 2014 spectacularly, and he's done it now. But he said that for him is this war, it's a life and death issue. That's what he has said. He's phrased himself like that several times. I think it's a life and death issue for him as the ruler in the Kremlin. And I think we won't get real peace. We might get the end of the war, but we won't get real peace until he has left the Kremlin the one way or the other.
Interesting insight, Carl Bildt, former peace negotiator, former Prime Minister, Foreign Minister of Sweden, and a man who's telling us things that perhaps some of the leaders don't tell us because they're always very on message here. The message coming from all the European leaders and NATO leaders is we will give whatever Ukraine wants, although President Zelensky says he's getting it all very late, and we will continue our military operations for as long as Ukraine needs us to do so, but everyone is looking not just to what's happening in Europe, but also potentially to the US electoral calendar in the next couple of years.
James, many thanks indeed. That's our diplomatic editor, James Bays, there live in Berlin. As we said, this is the first in a series of special programs on the anniversary of the war in Ukraine. We'll be live again from Kyiv at the same time tomorrow, but that's it from me for now.
Adrian, thanks very much. Make sure you join us at the same time as Adrian was saying. That's 11:30 GMT on Sunday, February 19th, for more on Ukraine war 1 year on.
Сьогодні Росія розпочала вторгнення в Україну. Путін розпочав війну з Україною, з усім демократичним світом.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back.
То, что происходит, вынужденная мера. Мы просто не оставили никаких шансов поступить иначе.
Я русский, на русском говорю. Русский это Путин, не я к тебе пришел.
I can't speak without tears. I'm sorry, but I'm really sorry for my country.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
The destiny of Ukraine is at stake, but our own fate also lies in the balance.
President Putin wanted less NATO, he's getting more NATO.
Для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
I fear the world is not sleepwalking into a wider war. I fear it's doing so with its eyes wide open.